I'm sure you've heard lots of folks say the following individual really doesn't need introduction. And Dr. North, to this group especially, probably doesn't really need introduction. But Dr. North has been advancing, promoting, and defending Christian Reconstruction since the 1960s and has been a lightning rod for criticism from outside our camp. Actually, using his wit and sharp writing, it's more like he caught most of those lightning bolts and returned them to sender. It would be inaccurate to say that Dr. North has produced an impressive body of work in his lifetime. Rather, he's produced an enormous and impressive body of work. The reach of that work has been magnified by the internet, a medium that Dr. North embraced and utilized earlier than most. In fact, many people, I've heard this many times, many different people have said that Dr. North writes books faster than most people can read them. I think there's a lot of truth to that. His ability to bring a topic into focus quickly and biblically has resulted in many of us reaching those aha moments we all look forward to. His zeal for his work is evident in his writing and speaking, as is his bright view of our Christian future. We're honored that Dr. North has accepted our invitation to speak today. We aimed high and were rewarded handsomely. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gary North.
I'm going to be making two presentations today. The first is on planting churches. The second is on building churches. In the first presentation, I'm going to be, I hope, proving a simple point, and that is we live in an era in which evangelism is more important than at any time in history. And I will also be showing that we live in a time of the most successful evangelism in the history of the church. This is not well understood, and I'm going to be spending most of my time on this point. That is not specifically a lot of attention to the need for evangelism, but instead on the issue of what kinds of evangelism programs are working best today and how churches can take advantage of them. I'm going to be using PowerPoint, and I know that most people get very discouraged when they see a PowerPoint presentation. I'm doing it for a purpose. I want you to know where I am in the process, and I also want to let me understand where I am in the process. So you can take notes, you'll know where I am in the presentation, but basically it boils down to this: if the power of my presentation depends upon my face, then of course the whole thing is doomed. We begin then with planting churches. Here's the challenge, and this is why we are facing the greatest challenge in the history of the church, and that is approximately 7.5 billion people are alive today, an extraordinary number of people. To give you some sense of the number of people, in 1900, there were approximately 1 billion people alive. That is, if we take seriously the story of the flood, from the time of Noah until 1900, it took that entire period for world population to reach 1 billion. It has taken a little over 1 century to get from that point to where we are today. And that is why I make the claim that we are living in the most important period in the history of man with respect to the need for evangelism. Percentages don't do us a lot of good. The issue is the sheer number of people who have not heard of the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, and how that affects their life on earth, in history, and their lives beyond the grave. It is estimated that there will be approximately 9.5 billion people in the year 2050. In other words, within a period of 35 years, this figure is going to go up by 2 billion more people. Now, this is a huge challenge. As I'll be talking about it today, the church generally, at least in the United States and certainly in Western Europe, is not taking advantage of this challenge, is not dealing successfully with this challenge. But that's not the main point, as I will attempt to show as this presentation goes on. Approximately 2.2 billion people are loosely defined as Christians today. Now, this means basically anyone who was baptized, perhaps was confirmed, maybe attended briefly, possibly will be married in a church, and his or her funeral will be conducted in a church. That is what the modern world means by Christian. In terms of what Protestants would call evangelical Christians, born-again Christians, there is nowhere near this number of people. It's too far behind. On the other hand, there is enormous growth, as I'm going to be presenting, but you can see the challenge. Western Europe's Christianity is dying. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this point. Compared to the Western Europe of 1900, basically Western Europe prior to the First World War, today's Christianity is a shadow of its former self. This is true in Protestant countries. It is increasingly true in Catholic countries. Spain, I think, is the best example. Up until the death of Francisco Franco in 1976, Spain was openly Catholic. There were laws against the practice of Protestantism. These laws were enforced. Spain was obviously a Catholic country. 4 decades later, it is a secular humanist country. The birth rate has fallen dramatically, way beyond what is called the replacement rate of 2.1 children per family. Spain is no longer Christian. There is not much trace of Christianity in terms of the culture of Ireland today compared to what it was 40 or 50 years ago. With respect to the Protestant countries, there's no question that Protestantism is fading. It is no longer a significant factor in the lives of Western Europeans. With respect to America's Christianity, it is in retreat. Again, I don't need to spend a lot of time trying to get this point across. We can see it in the number of people who attend church at least once a month. We can certainly see it in terms of the number of churches that are being planted compared to the number of people in terms of population growth that are coming into the pipeline. The pipeline of new people being born is large. The number of churches being planted is nowhere near the percentage of the people who are being born or who are immigrating into the country. So in terms of the influence of Christianity, it is fading. And in terms of the American political tradition, basically one of pluralism, there has not been much political influence of Christianity, although in terms of social order, yes, we have been a Christian country. In terms of the impact of the church on the lives of people, this has been a Christian country. But it has faded, and faded dramatically, since the mid-1970s. I want to talk, however, about what the rival positions are. And what we find around the world is a crisis of faith. And this also is unique in history. Always there has been some major rival of Christianity in the world. Now, the main one has been the same for about 1400 years, Islam, and that is no different today. But in terms of any potential replacement of Islam in the world scene, there has not been anything rivaling Christianity. Yes, Hinduism has a lot of support in India in terms of the number of people, Buddhism, but these are ancient faiths. If we're talking about any new faith that would challenge Christianity, or for that matter challenge Islam, they are fading rapidly. The obvious one is Marxism. It had relatively little influence right up until the Russian Revolution in October of 1917. The success of Lenin and the Bolsheviks retroactively baptized Marxism. Marxism was not a major force in the West or anywhere else prior to Lenin. So beginning in 1917, Marxism got a foothold in the Soviet Union, and then after World War II spread to China. China abandoned Marxism as an economic philosophy in 1979. Deng Xiaoping basically dropped the system. Politically, of course, the rulers of the country are still officially communist, no doubt about that. But if we're talking about the economy, it is not Marxist in any way, shape, or form. Then, in 1991, on the greatest Christmas day in the modern world, December 25th, Gorbachev announced that the USSR was no more, communism went out of business, and the new Russian Federation took over. That was the end of Marxism. It is not a serious contender in the minds of men anywhere in the world today outside of Cuba and North Korea. Then there is Darwinism. Now, this is a powerful faith. It is a rival faith, but it is elitist. The broad masses of the world have never accepted it. Certainly in the West, they have not accepted it. Even those people who believe in evolution say that God directs evolution. God has had a hand in directing the forces of evolution. Well, that was the argument Charles Darwin was opposed to. He really wasn't battling Christianity. He didn't really care that much about Christianity. What he was battling against was the idea that there was any purpose in nature which in any way directed the evolution of nature. That was the great enemy of Darwinism, and it remains the great enemy. And on that basis, even in the United States, probably no more than 20% of the population believes in anything like original Darwinism. The other 80% is divided between those who don't believe in evolution and those who believe in evolution but who believe that God was directing it from the very beginning. Darwinism is the faith of an elitist core of whatever society we're talking about. That, no doubt about it, is the most important rival faith, rival worldview to Christianity, other than, obviously, Islam. But Darwinism, again, is not a widespread faith. Then there is the welfare state. Now, that's a powerful religion today. The welfare state is widely believed in. Even in the Tea Party movement, you would occasionally see signs that would say, "Don't take away my Medicare," which is basically a defense of the welfare state. But the problem here is the immensity of the unfunded liabilities. The expert here is Professor Lawrence Gottlieb of Boston University. Based on the government's own statistics, He has estimated that the present value of the unfunded liabilities for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid now are in the range of $210 trillion. Now, that's not what is going to be owed in the future. That is what the government would have to have right now to invest outside of the government in profitable investments that would enable the federal government to meet its promised blessings to the public with respect to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. $210 trillion of present value. Statistically, it's not going to happen. The government is going to default on these promises, and yet these promises are at the heart of men's faith in the American welfare state. And all of those promises are going to be violated, or if at least not all of them, they're going to be fudged and fudged and fudged again. Cutoffs in what was promised, and families are going to have to intervene to pick up the slack, and families are not prepared for this psychologically, and they are certainly not prepared for this economically. Optimism is fading among the elite, and this did not just start yesterday. This started in the late 19th century, certainly with respect to European philosophy. There was a deep pessimistic strain in European philosophy, not a dominant strain, but a powerful strain prior to the First World War. But after the First World War, optimism faded fast. The biggest holdouts with respect to pessimism were the Marxists, who did have a philosophy of history, of inevitable history, who did have a philosophy of the inevitable triumph of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. But with the death of Marxism, no later than 1991, that great holdout philosophy of optimism no longer has any influence. And that means that any kind of optimism, which is so fundamental to sustaining any worldview, is now missing in action. And Robert Nisbet, in his marvelous book on the history of the idea of progress, ends it in the conclusion by saying, if this optimism is not restored, Western civilization will not maintain itself. He said that no society has ever been able to maintain itself without a fundamental and widespread optimism across the whole population. You have to have optimism about the future, and he said it has faded. Now, he wrote that in 1980. He said, it doesn't look like anything is going to come out of Western culture or Western philosophy to replace the pessimism which is so powerful today. So he said maybe there will be a revival, a religious revival of some kind which will restore optimism to Western culture and therefore save Western civilization. There is political gridlock in the West. It is clear, certainly at this time, the division between those who favor Trump and those who oppose Trump is unbridgeable. There is no goodwill on either side. We see in Great Britain that Prime Minister May called that special election, thinking she was going to gain this great majority so that she could conduct the Brexit, which she in fact never really believed in. And as a result of her surprise election, she was the most surprised of all. And the Conservative Party lost its majority and is now having to make an alliance with a political party that was started by Reverend Ian Paisley, the most hardcore, loudmouth, loud Calvinist probably in the second half of the 20th century. That guy really was confrontational rhetorically. He took no prisoners. Now, the party is not so hardcore as it was under Paisley, but certainly that party is now basic to May's attempt to put together a coalition government. We have in France something that has never happened before. Somebody was elected prime minister who didn't have a political party. He is now scrambling around trying to put together a real live political party with real people coming into the parliament because he didn't have anybody else. This has never happened in French political history. It's gridlock. When you compare the political leaders today with the political leaders in 1985, Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, for that matter, Deng Xiaoping, plus you had the leadership of Pope John Paul II. This was a period of articulate political leadership. That era is gone. It has been gone since certainly 1990. It's gone. There is no hope politically. Everything is a holding action. Everything now is keep the other guys out. There's no vision of victory. There's vision at most of not quite a stalemate. Anybody who preaches not quite a stalemate is considered a wild-eyed political optimist today. Then there is fragmentation of the media. We all know about this. It's technologically based. You don't have in the United States 3 networks any longer. The cable networks are tiny. They may have a couple of million viewers, 3 million viewers, or 4 million at any given time. Tiny. Hardly anybody watches the various cable news networks. Newspapers are going out of business. The folding, physically printed newspaper is a thing of the past, almost. They're all shrinking. People don't read them any longer. It's yesterday's news. So there is no dominant media force today. There's nobody with even anything remotely like a monopoly. There's not much of an oligopoly, and it's disintegrating rapidly. We are seeing what some people have called the balkanization of opinion, and it's happening all over the world. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. With the coming of the browser, the graphical interface browser in 1995, all of the media began the process of disintegration. There is moral decline. It has been visible since certainly the mid-1970s. It is happening throughout the West. It is taking place in Western Europe. It is taking place, obviously, in the United States. The moral world in which I grew up of the 1950s is, in retrospect, considered happy days. And by the way, happy days was what that era was called about 40 years ago. It was already seen as nostalgia. It was understood, certainly by the mid-70s or the late 70s, that the 50s were over. We have falling birth rates all over the world. No Western nation is above 2.1 children per family. The United States was, mainly because of immigration from Latin America, right up until the 2008-2009 recession. Birth rates dropped after that. We are still in the 1.8, perhaps something in that range. In Europe, it's down to 1.5, 1.3. It has collapsed. Even, astoundingly, even in Iran, it is collapsing. Muslim birth rates are falling. Muslim women, when they get an education, don't have 6 or 7 children. They have maybe 3. Now, they have more children than the whites of Europe have, no question about that, but Muslim birth rates are falling. This generally is a sign of growing loss of faith in the future. There is a loss of a cultural center. The West doesn't have it. There was, to some extent, at least rhetorically, cultural center with John Paul II. And millions of people paid attention to what he said. There's been no one like him since his death. The 21st century has had no one comparable to John Paul II. So now we have a situation, and I think it's pretty obvious, nobody speaks for the general public in any country other than North Korea. And if the representation and the articulation of a philosophy is dependent upon a fat kid with that haircut, then I think it's pretty well over in North Korea. Visibly weak political leaders are endemic now throughout the world. In every continent, we don't have powerful political leaders. And yet political leadership is supposed to represent society. At least that's the view of the modern world. This has been the view of Western civilization since at least the beginning of the 18th century. Politics is, if not everything, it is most of everything. And leadership is defined as political leadership, and there aren't any of them left any longer. Now, I see this as important. And that's because of what I see in terms of opportunities for evangelism. It's the old issue of you can't beat something with nothing. And with the exception of Islam, and with the exception of Hinduism and to a limited extent Buddhism, religions going back even before Christianity, the opponents offer pretty much nothing. Institutionally, philosophically, they don't offer significant challenges to the gospel today. Now, I would say the same is probably true of Islam. Maybe. But Islam is going to face a crisis when the oil revenues finally depart. And in the second half of the 21st century, I think that's going to take place. The question is, what religion, what worldview can offer a serious challenge to the fading religions and fading worldviews, not only of Western civilization, but now to international, worldwide civilization? And I think Christianity is the most obvious candidate of a comprehensive worldview which can serve as an alternative to the fading worldviews of Western civilization and, for that matter, world civilization. We have existing congregations. Certainly we have them in the United States. Tens of millions of people are active members of congregations that we would call evangelical. And you have existing congregations within the Catholic Church. Now, as I'm going to say later in the presentation, the most important area of evangelism for Catholics is the Catholic Church. I think this is understood, by the way, in African Catholic churches, whose leaders understand clearly that Western European Catholicism is declining and, in fact, shows signs of rigor mortis setting in. And what we would call old-style traditional Catholics, the Catholics that prevailed before Vatican II, understand what has taken place, but they're older. Nevertheless, there's money, there's membership, there's a huge real estate investment that churches have made. These constitute capital assets. So we have to say that opportunities for evangelism are great in the United States, and that in terms of missionary activity, the United States has always been the major source of worldwide evangelism, certainly since the end of the 19th century. Then we have digital media. We can finally do an end run around the three major networks. They are, of course, major networks, but only by comparison. They are retreating. And we're beginning to see that we can, at least technologically speaking, make an end run around the public schools. It is now possible to deliver high-quality education, K through 12, and for that matter, K through graduate school, online and free of charge, and Salman Khan has proven it. This is not hypothetical. The Khan Academy is delivering high-quality education free of charge all over the world, and now is spreading to other languages. Now, this means that we have the ability to make serious inroads into the lives of people around the world based on technology which, for all intents and purposes, is free of charge. In other words, we have to spend time, but we don't have to spend a great deal of money. And if you don't think this is true, what are you doing at this moment? You are sitting in a room, and I am sitting in a room hundreds of miles away, and you could just as easily be in India or China as where you are right now. The barrier in terms of space is essentially now gone for the purposes of communication. Furthermore, the barrier in terms of money is almost gone. Certainly for the upper middle classes of the world, it is gone. So, you have this problem. Humanist media undermine theocracies. They have done this for a long time. The war has been in the West between the humanist theocracy, which has controlled increasingly the media of the West, versus the older theocracies of Christianity. Now, humanist media have not been successful behind the oil curtain, certainly, of Saudi Arabia. There has not been any kind of successful penetration of the theocracies of Islamic countries over the last 100 years. But even there, it is beginning to break down. And over time, Islam is going to have to deal with humanism. Christianity, at least, has been in this battle against humanism since the Renaissance. We're better equipped as Christians to deal with it. Well, humanist media now are in the process of disintegration. They are increasingly on the defensive. So now the question is, what kind of worldview, what kind of theocratic worldview is going to replace the theocratic worldview of humanism? Humanism has placed the autonomous individual or the autonomous state at the pinnacle of its theocratic hierarchy, its theocratic pyramid. The humanist believes that man is God, if only by default, but increasingly not just by default, but by man's ability to create a new humanity, a new social order, new species even. And yet the confidence is fading. Yes, humanists and the rest of us believe that there will be technological progress, but that is no longer sufficient to give people optimism that this progress is going to be used for the benefit of humanity. And yes, there can be some great breakthrough in terms of fighting a disease, and out of a very similarly equipped laboratory, there can be a great breakthrough in developing some kind of killer spore that will kill 100 million people. So the optimism is always facing pessimism when we come to the issue of any kind of developed technology. Christian media can now cross national borders. That is a tremendous breakthrough. Now, there can be ways of governments to block this, but in fact, I am presently in communication with a man in China, Christian man in China, who wants to put the Ron Paul curriculum into the hands of Chinese homeschoolers and day schoolers behind what used to be called the bamboo curtain. It's very subtle. There's not going to be a lot of publicity. The test has already been made. He has decided to continue. The rest of the curriculum over the next year or two will be made available in English for people looking for English as a second language. And I have said repeatedly, the whole idea is to get this information, this curriculum, translated into Chinese and placed in a Chinese historical and cultural setting. And he understands this. So it's really only a model that he intends to use. It's not going to be a final curriculum. It's just going to be a working model for him and other teachers to use to begin to make available a complete alternative curriculum, kindergarten through what we would call 12th grade. Now we have movement of the masses to cities. This has been going on in the West for approximately 400 years, and it keeps accelerating. Well, this favors Christianity. Christianity was never primarily a rural religion. It was a religion initially of the Roman Empire and of the urban centers of Rome. The whole idea of pagan originally meant somebody living in a village. So Christianity has always done well in cities. Then we have the loss of legitimacy of rural institutional orders, and this is a major factor in modern life. The old line out of World War I in the United States in a popular song was this: how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? In other words, if you send a couple of 100,000 young men who have been recruited off the farms, half of them off the farms, and you send them overseas and they begin to see European urban culture, they're not going to go back to the farms. They're not going to relocate in the farms, and even if they do, they will have their whole worldview transformed by the fact that they came into contact with urban culture. And that is what has happened. There isn't much farming left in the United States. Maybe half of the population was involved in agriculture in 1900. Today, it's about 2% of the population, with maybe another 10 or 12% in small towns that would support farming but would not be actively involved in farming. Rural life was called by Marx idiocy. The idiocy of rural life is a famous phrase by Marx. Well, I wouldn't say that people today call rural life idiocy. They just don't want to live there anymore. Now we have what I want to focus on somewhat extensively, what has been called the new Christendom, or the next Christendom. Both phrases are common. A great transformation is taking place, and as we like to say in America, it has taken place under everybody's radar. It has been going on under our noses, but as George Orwell said so long ago, it takes systematic effort to pay attention to what goes on under our noses. In sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, and in Asia, there is a religious transformation going on, the likes of which we have never seen before. And it has been going on extensively for at least 40 years, really since the mid-60s, but visibly since the mid-1970s. Africa in 1900 had about 10 million people who identified themselves as Christians out of maybe, I would say 100 million. Today, one estimate, that by Philip Jenkins, is 360 million. No one knows this is going on. 360 million people. Now, these are people who made some kind of a commitment in a society that wasn't Christian. In other words, new converts who tend to be harder core, who tend to be more activist than people who grew up in the church or who are the grandchildren of people who grew up in the church. Now, again, these numbers are, I would say, only for initial estimates. There are no scientific plans out there to make some kind of statistically precise survey of total population. But you can certainly understand that 360 million is a lot more than 10 million. Then we have South America. Jenkins' estimate is 480 million. Now, that would also include Catholics. And the degree of the commitment of Catholics today is probably minimal in Latin America because Catholicism has been there, obviously, since the 16th century. So a lot of it is conservative and traditional and not very active. But certainly, Protestantism is growing rapidly in Latin America. It's becoming a major social force and potentially at some point could become a political force depending on the worldview of the Protestants and fundamentalists and Pentecostals who are pioneering this major breakthrough into South America. The pullback of the Catholic Church since 1965 at the end of Vatican II has fundamentally weakened the ability of Catholics around the world, traditional Catholics, to resist the spread of evangelical Protestantism. Traditional Catholics have been on the defensive trying to deal with the popes since about 1958. The problem that traditional Catholics have today is not the fact that fundamentalists and Pentecostals are making inroads outside the church. The problem that traditional Catholics have is that liberals, radicals, and homosexuals are making inroads inside the four walls of the church. And I mention this only because only this week there was an enormous scandal that hit the media about a homosexual orgy in which a Catholic cardinal was involved. And all of the talk about pedophilia has been focused mainly on the Catholic Church. And by the way, there isn't pedophilia in the Catholic Church. It's statistically no different from any other pedophilia percentage around the world. Pedophilia is the preferred phrase of homosexuals in the media to describe homosexual activity between Catholic priests and young men who are in their teens and late teens in many cases. Anybody under 18 is defined as a child, and therefore they would prefer to call it pedophilia than to call it what it is, the seduction of homosexual teenage boys by homosexual priests. We have Asia, 313 million. Now, obviously, nobody knows what's going on in China. These are house churches. And heads of those churches are arrested and sent to prison or concentration camps for decades, but their wives take over. And they have a real problem in China in terms of public relations of arresting wives and sending them to concentration camps. The government admits to at least 25 million. I don't think anybody believes it's that low. Low-end figures are in the range of 100 million, 150 million. Nobody really knows. It is in certainly the range of 100 million to 200 million, and it may be higher, and it's spreading. And the way in which it's spreading is through house churches. And of course, it's difficult to get any kind of statistics about them because they're clandestine churches. So it's a good thing that we don't know how many of them there are. But we do know that they are multiplying compared with what it was in the mid-1970s during the period of the persecution by the Red Guards, when probably Protestantism was down to maybe 10 million active members. What we're seeing today is historically extraordinary, and it is spreading. Now, Pentecostals, again, nobody knows. 400 million of them is a reasonable estimate. 250 million of them is a lowball estimate. You can get these figures in this website. Actually, it's not a website, it's a short link, but if you type it in, you'll go to the original article, and it was published in 2002 in the Atlantic. It is, in this sense, public domain. The liberals know about this. This was not done in a corner. And if you write this down and just type this in on your web browser, you'll go to the original article. This is a short link that I've used with Bitly, which I use all the time, so that people can remember these otherwise long URLs. If they couldn't remember, I think you can remember Jenkins Next, and by the way, it's case sensitive. Now I want to talk about the church planting movement. It's non-Pentecostal and gets almost no attention, and there's nothing else like it in the world, and there's never been anything else like it in the world, and essentially one man invented it. And he gets no credit, and he wants no credit. He won't take money. I've offered to donate. He won't even answer. Only Christian ministry I've ever heard of where if you write and say, would you like me to send money, they don't answer. A unique Christian ministry. The man's name is David Watson. And YouTube videos and other videos of Watson pop up, and they don't stay up. Now, I don't think the devil's taking them down, but somebody is taking them down, because I began finding them 3 or 4 years ago. I was captivated by them. Then I'd go back to find them again, gone. So I'll describe what he did. He was a missionary to the Bhojpuri people in Bihar, India. He went in the late 1980s. There were something in the range of 80 million of them who spoke the language, or who speak the language. And they are, or were, a hard place to gain converts. Hard people, hard place. It was called the Graveyard of Missions and Missionaries, and it was well named. There were maybe 24 churches in the late 1980s, maybe, and they weren't strong churches. They were at best footholds. And that was what he faced when he went to India. In 1990, he had some converts. 6 of them were murdered. And it threw him into a crisis, a personal crisis, as you can well understand. He'd been told, by the way, warned, in fact, that this was likely to happen. He got the converts, and that is exactly what happened. He was a traditional evangelist. He was a traditional missionary using traditional techniques. And nothing had worked in this area of northern India ever. Then, in 1991, he was expelled. Now, in one presentation, he said he was not expelled for religious reasons. He said he thinks he was expelled because some bureaucrats in India were angry about the fact that the United States had invaded Kuwait, and it was a political reaction against the invasion, and he got scooped up and tossed out. So he went to Singapore, and he went into what I would call Jonah syndrome. And he was in it for months. He once described it. He said he would go into his office. He would never turn on the lights. And he would spend the day praying. And he would pray over and over and over, I don't want to go back. Send somebody else. I'll go to the United States. I'm a good businessman. I've made money in the past. I'll give a bunch of money to missions. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back. Well, God paid no attention to him. 0 attention. And finally, he began to change the prayer. Slow learner, and he began to pray, all right, but you've got to show me what will work. I know what won't work. I've found out what won't work. I want to know what will work. And he said, God basically told him, you're going to have to find replacements. You need at least 5 people. And he began to pray. And he began to recruit. And he began to get the word out. And one by one, slowly, he found them. 4 men and 1 woman. In 1992, then, he had 5 assistants towards the end of the year. And he said, okay, that's it. I'm willing to go back. And he began a wholly new approach to missions, to foreign missions. Radically new methodology. And he's humble about it. He said, the only reason I promote it now is that it works. He said it wasn't some grand scheme in terms of a philosophical commitment. He said, if it hadn't worked, I would have dropped it. But it worked. Oh, baby, did it work. He said, I got to locate a person of peace. This was an intermediary. A local representative, and he got this out of the original injunction by Jesus to go out into a community and find somebody, stay at that person's home. If you don't find that person, move on. So he called him a person of peace. He gave one example. Incredible. He walked into a village and an old man came up to him and said, at last you've come. And he said, well, yeah, I'm here. And the man said, I have waited 20 years. And Watson said, well, what do you mean waited? He said, every night for 20 years, I had a dream that you would come, and now you have come, and I'll take you to my house. Now that, of course, did not happen often. That's one of the stories you tell if you're a missionary, but you usually tell a story like that to raise money. Watson doesn't tell stories to raise money. He tells stories to gain recruits who will join him in this effort. He would study the targeted group's worldview. Now, he had one basic group he was after, the Bhojpuri. But he said that's the strategy. And then he said, depending on what they believe and what are the big stories in their lives, you have to find equivalent Bible stories that will then serve as hooks to pull them from what they believe in now, but are maybe losing faith in or have found really are not productive in their lives. Find them something similar in the Christian story that will be productive in their lives. Well, that seems like a reasonable strategy. You would think, gee, why didn't they think of this before? He sets up house churches, basically family churches. He deals one family at a time, or once in a while, one business at a time, but usually house churches. He deals with one man, he and the person of peace, and basically the evangelist goes in to train the person of peace. The evangelist is not setting up to become a full-time missionary in that town. That's the opposite of the strategy. The missionary is primarily a trainer. He gives the initial boost by showing how a church runs, but then at that point, he bows out, and in fact, he may leave. He may stay for a year or two to provide training, but he's not the primary figure in the penetration of that town. The person of peace in, and then other people have been trained in the house church, become the new people who go out and penetrate someone else's family, some other business, somebody else in the community, and then it reproduces. Now, I hate to say this, but we have the model for this. It's a downline. This is Amway, except they're not selling soap. They're using this in a downline structure to create churches. That's the strategy, and it is working unbelievably well. This new methodology is based on the missionary asking questions, and then the attendees answer. And Watson keeps telling people, zip your lip, shut up, ask the question, and then say, what does the Bible say? Now, initially, they didn't have a Bible. It wasn't translated. So he had to use audio tapes to translate the Bible. So it was a difficult time initially, and yet it worked incredibly well. He wants 6 or 7 or 8 people working together to try to find answers to specific practical questions about the issues that face their families, practical problems they're facing. What does the Bible say about this? And then he listens. Yes, okay, anybody else? Yes, okay, anybody else? And he says, here's what happens. If you get 6 or 7 people into a discussion as a group, they won't get too far astray. He said, we don't have any heretics. He said, heretics are always real smart guys with a gift of gab. Our people, he said, aren't real smart people with gifts of gab. They're just people who want to find out what the Bible says, and they work it out. So what they found, to use technical terminology, the 10th church down, the church of the church of the church of the church, holds basically the same theology as the original church. Because the absence of these dynamic leaders who take people off on strange pathways is not there in this system, because the opinions of 6 or 7 people talking together and trying to work through the passages keeps the basic message on track, church after church. They call them daughter churches, granddaughter churches, and so forth. Weekly prayer for needs of specific people. Everybody is asked, okay, do you know anybody with a problem? Well, everybody knows somebody with a problem. Okay, write it down. Well, of course, if they're illiterate, they can't write it down, but they're trained to memorize. So remember who that person is. Then the next week, the next meeting, the leader says, okay, you were going to deal with somebody, you were going to talk with somebody, you were going to raise the issue, you have a solution for his problem. What did he say? Well, of course, you know what the person says. Gee, I just didn't get around to talking with him. Oh, well, that's okay. Talk to him this week. Well, about the 3rd or the 4th week of being called on the carpet just to give a testimony of what the person said, nothing else, just what did you tell him? Well, he gets embarrassed. So then the next week he finally tells him. That's how they gain the recruits. That's how the evangelism goes. People asking questions, or they'll do something like this. You know, an interesting thing, I found out something really important about God this week. Then he is instructed to shut up. And if the person doesn't say, oh yeah, what did you find out? He doesn't say anything. But he's supposed to say, I found out something about God this week, or I found out something about solving a problem in my family this week. And then he waits. He waits for an answer. Well, what did you find out? Then he's been invited to tell. And that's the hook. You get the invitation. In 1999, he had 40,000 churches, 85 members each. And he tells the story. He said about the time he had 2,000 churches, and he wouldn't name the agency that sent him out, the agency sent him some forms and said, well, write down what you've accomplished so far. And this was only a couple of years in. So he wrote down, well, I've got 2,000 churches. He sent it back. And he got a letter back. So, no, you don't understand the form. You've misunderstood the form. And I remember one of the videos, which of course is gone by now, he said, they were really telling me you're lying through your teeth. So you know what his answer was? Send a team and take a look. And the agency did. Send in a team to take a look. So they did a preliminary survey, and they wrote back and they said, well, when we got here, there were probably at least 2,000, but there's so many of them now that have started in the time that we have done the survey that we really don't know. 40,000 churches. Now, this was 7 years later. In 2000, he leaves India. He sees that his work is done. They don't need him anymore. The whole system is built on the premise that you leave. It's a hit and run deal. They don't want the missionaries staying there once the system is self-sustaining. 2005, 80,000 churches. 2015, 100,000 churches. This, in the part of India that was called the graveyard of missions and missionaries. This in a region 15 years before, well, 25 years before, 6 of the converts were murdered. Hadn't planted a successful church, not one, in 1989, not one. No paid pastors. Everybody who does it because he believes in it. Everybody takes the responsibility because he believes in it. And the leadership is not the kind of leadership we're used to anyway. It's a leadership of asking questions such as, oh, did you talk with somebody this week? Who did you talk with? Or the question, what does the Bible say about this? Well, a lot of people can do this, or at least you'd think so, but they find that these pastors or leaders do need training. It's not easy to do this and be successful. Just asking the right questions. Gee, you'd say, well, that's easy. No, it really isn't easy. And being a model, a moral model, is not easy. And keeping your mouth shut when you know the answer, Watson says, is about the most difficult thing of all. Just shut up, ask the question, and shut up and let the people come to what they will conclude is the right answer, and in all cases, or at least most cases, he says, it will be the right answer. And even if initially it isn't the right answer, give it some time. They'll pursue it, it won't work, and then they'll come up with the right answer. You have to have faith in the process. You have to have faith in people's commitment to the church. The teams are really dedicated. 6 hours a day of prayer, 3 hours for themselves, and 3 hours for the team. Now, these people usually hold jobs. They're probably not paid. In fact, after a year or two, they aren't paid because they're indigenous recruits. But they have committed themselves to this degree of prayer, and that becomes the way to screen them. You don't screen them in terms of some kind of confession of faith. You screen them in terms of commitment. And to make this work, at least according to Watson, it's 6 hours a day of prayer, plus whatever you do for a living. The 6 hours have got to come out of somewhere. Now, presumably it comes out of their families or comes out of their entertainment, their leisure time. It comes out of somewhere. And this is how the thing is built up. Then they do have regional training conferences. They do have that. They do raise money for that. But those aren't very often. And they bring these guys in to talk. Watson, I once heard in, I'm sure now a long departed video, said that he doesn't deal one-on-one with anybody who wants training who has not started a church, that has started a church, that has started a church, that has started a church. He wants it 4 layers down, then he'll spend time with the guy. Well, that's right. His time is valuable. He can't waste his time successfully. He has to limit it by something. He's not limiting it by money, so he limits it on a one-on-one situation to a successful person who has started churches, and there may be 100 churches under this guy's initial authority. Now remember, it's not hierarchical. It's not a church court system. He's not building churches, and he says this. He says, I'm not a church builder. I'm a church planter. And this model is now less than 30 years old. So while they do build up churches, it's not a system that is hierarchical. Inherently, it's not hierarchical. There's no court system yet. I think there's going to be one. And that's when the crisis is going to come. Now, I'll mention something else. Watson has said, and others in the movement have said, there is a way to stop this process. And in fact, only one thing has stopped it. It's not demonic prayers. It's not government bureaucratic interference. Only one thing stops the multiplication of the churches: a church building. The minute a church building goes up and has to be paid for, the minute people invite other people to attend church in a church building, then there's going to be a church pastor. And at that point, the multiplication ceases. The whole model becomes Western. And at that point, it stops. Once they adopt the Western system of church building, that particular church no longer is part of this incredible downline multiplication process. Now, at some point, churches have to be built. And that's going to be the great change that is going to take place in this movement. That's when the rubber is going to meet the road in terms of what it means to start a church. Because it's not a good enough policy just to start more and more and more churches. You have to build the church. But as Watson says, that's not what his specialty is. He's a man who understands his limitations. And what he has done is extraordinary. And now they're more like him. Now, I don't know if there's anyone who's this successful, but there are men out there, in Africa, for example, who have started, and now, as a result, 2,000 churches are operating. You can read about this, another short link from bit.ly, Watson, India. Watson is capitalized, India is capitalized. You can get at least a brief story about this where you get some of the dates and some of the statistics. The African program is similar basic strategy. Now again, let me point out, this is not Pentecostal. As far as I know, people have looked at it. They've said this is not Pentecostalism. The model's different. This is reproducible apart from what the Pentecostals discuss as signs of the Spirit, marks of the Spirit. This is just the usual marks of the Spirit. That is, change of confession, change of lifestyle, change of priorities. The focus is on worldview. You have to find the hook. Each tribe is different. Each confession is different. They have to find some way, somehow, of making the connection between the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the offer of salvation to the targeted group. And this is not easy. It may take years. Watson says it looks like this thing is an incredibly fast process. He said it isn't fast at all. He said the first front-end process, where the time and the prayer initially go, doesn't seem to accomplish much of anything. It's developing the people to be trained. It's to develop the confidence that people have in the message. It's difficult at the front end, but once it gets going, then it looks like a multi-level downline operation. That's because that's what it is. So he says it's an illusion to think this doesn't take a lot of work. However, they do have to focus on worldview. That is a basic strategy that they need to know. Of course, they are also looking for the person of peace, and that person can help them because that person is in a particular community. He knows the people, he knows the crises, he knows the problems, he knows the good guys, he knows the bad guys, he knows what he's dealing with, and the missionary doesn't try to presume this. The missionary has to learn the language, he has to be fluent in the language, and he has to know the strategy, and he has to understand the worldview, but he is not the primary figure when he comes into that community. The person of peace is. And Watson and these guys adhere to it. If they don't find the person of peace, they move on to the next community. They don't waste time with missionary efforts that don't produce fruit fast in terms of the representative. It's point 2 of the biblical covenant if you're looking for an answer in terms of biblical theology. It's the doctrine of representation. Somebody has to speak on behalf of the gospel, and that's the person of peace. They look for the Bible stories to serve as hooks. They try to get a handle on these stories. What do the stories mean to the people? How can we find an equivalent in the story of the gospel or the Old Testament? How can we find a hook that really does connect to the most important hooks in this community, in this language group? And if they don't find this, they're hampered. Then you have to have a key benefit. Well, surprise, surprise. Why should I change my mind? Asks the person. There are two issues, two questions that you have to deal with if you're in direct marketing. Same two questions apply to academia. The same two questions apply to evangelism. Two questions, 4 words, and they are rhetorical questions, and they are negative rhetorical questions. The first question is this one, so what? And the second question is this one, who says? And if you can't deal with the first question of so what, you won't even get to the second question of who says. Or the variation in English is not a question, says who or says you. Okay? Who says or says you, it's the same response. But you got to at least get to that stage, and that is, so what? Home missions in the United States. Now let's begin to apply this to the present situation in the United States, which still is the nation that sends out the most foreign missionaries, which still is the country in which Christianity has at least, if not a foothold, it's more of a clinging to the edge of the cliff hold. We don't have a foothold in the United States, it's a cliff hold. We had a foothold in the United States in the 18th century. We have been pushed to the edge of the cliff ever since. Roman Catholics, well, they've got the numbers, and they've got the real estate. So what is the home mission field for Roman Catholics? Well, it's the Roman Catholic Church. 77 million listed members. Now, to get that would take some doing, because 77 million people don't show up on a Sunday to attend church. But the church accepts this. It's got to be true. I found it on Wikipedia. The church is not going to argue with this. It's somewhere like 77 million people who call themselves Roman Catholics. That's a large church. That's the largest percentage church in the United States. The average age in 2008 really, of a priest was 63 years old. In 1970, it was about 35 years old. 63 years old, if they had been part of Social Security, which probably they were not. They could opt out and did. But if they were part of it, they could be collecting early retirement monthly payments from the Social Security system, which allows you to start getting money at age 62. 63 years old. Well, let me tell you, if it went from 35 to 63, it's not going to go from 63 in round numbers to 100. It's not going to do that. So either there's going to be a lock-in at some point at 70 or 75, something like that, and then what we're going to find is that the church simply is not going to grow. They won't be able to grow it anymore. You're not going to see that happen. It's going to lock in, they're going to die, and the church is not going to get any older in terms of leadership. So where are they going to get the leaders? Now that is the leadership of the priests. We're talking Catholic Church. The backbone of the church up through Vatican II was not the priesthood. It was the nuns. The nuns were the ones who did the grunt work. The nuns taught in the Catholic schools. The nuns went in and visited sick people. The nuns did the grunt work. What about them? 74 years old in 2012. I'm sure it's older now. 74. They're not on Social Security. These are old women. Now, how are you going to support them financially? The church has never put aside money. The church is on a pay-as-you-go system. The Roman Catholic Church imitated Franklin Roosevelt's financing. Not a good decision. No money was put aside. These women must be supported now. And it's going to take church money to support them. And where are they going to get the money? 2015, 595 seminary graduates. Half were monks, and it was up. I mean, this was a cause of rejoicing. It's normally 500 a year. And half of them are monks, regular clergy. They don't go into the parishes. They're not diocesan priests. You're only talking 250 to 300 men coming out in the United States to minister to 77 million people. They turn out about the same number of seminary grads as conservative Presbyterians turn out. And conservative Presbyterians are dealing with what in terms of numbers of members? 500,000 if you're stretching it? Maybe. Probably less, but maybe 500,000. And they keep multiplying these seminaries. The seminaries keep setting up branches in different cities. So the number of graduates is increasing. Number of churches, sadly, is not increasing that fast. But these young men are able to fill the needs of 500,000 people. Okay, maybe 500,000 people. What are you going to do with 77 million people? With the same number of graduates to fill those positions as conservative Presbyterianism has. I'll tell you what's going to happen. There's going to be a redefinition of what constitutes a priest. Latinos are dominant in numbers, but not priests. They speak Spanish, but the priests don't. Where are the priests from? I'll tell you where the priests are from. They're all from Poland. Well, not quite, but pretty much. Poland is still cranking out enough priests. Maybe some Irish, but they're not coming indigenously. They're not Americans producing these men. They're imports. Maybe they'd come from Latin America. They better hope that they come from Latin America. But the American church is not in a condition to deal with these people. They don't know what to do with them. And these people don't attend very often. They don't attend confession anymore. Confession is a sacrament of the church, and hardly anybody goes anymore prior to Mass. They can't. There are not enough priests to hear confession. Now let's look at the Protestants. What are the Protestants doing or not doing, as the case may be? Here's an interesting chart. You can see up here, those are the mainstream, mainline churches, down, 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 down. They've gone since the mid-1960s, when it first became obvious. Now, these are the evangelical members, up, 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 up. But where does it leave, you see? They're not replacing the number of mainline churchmen or churchwomen who have departed from those congregations. So the church is at best, and really not at best, staying even with population growth. Church isn't staying with population growth. There's some vague increase, and evangelicals, yes, are taking the lion's share of it. But they're falling behind. If you're talking about the evangelization of the American people, they're falling behind. About 26% of the population would be considered evangelicals, maybe. Now again, Barna is the source of these figures. That's probably the best source we've got. There are rival figures. This is close enough for government work. 26% of the population. But do they actually attend? Do you have problems getting to church when you set out for church in terms of traffic? Is it as busy on the highway or the side streets going to church as it is when you try to go to work? No, obviously not. The mainline churches, maybe 16%. They're in disintegration. Well, that's healthy. These people should get out of the evangelism business. And in fact, they haven't been in it anyway for 80 years. So they're fading. Church versus unchurched, about 55% to 45%. But let's not be naive about this, okay? When we're using a figure like this, when you're talking churched, you mean maybe once a month. These are not people who go every week to hear the message of the gospel. They're not people who go every week to have communion, because Protestant churches don't have weekly communion. These are occasional people who don't normally threaten your parking space in the parking lot, and they probably get there late anyway, so you were able to get your space. These are churched only in the loosest sense. These are not strongly committed people. In contrast, the unchurched people are really committed to not going to church. I mean, they really believe in not going to church. When you ask these people, do you have a good reason for going home or going to the movies or going out to eat or going wherever it is you go or stay on a Sunday, do you have a good reason? The person doesn't think he has to have a good reason, but he may have one. He'll probably say, I just don't get much out of church. Well, he hasn't been in 30 years, so he's not lying. He doesn't get much out of church at all, and he doesn't think he can get much out of church. And he doesn't really intend to try to find out if he can get much out of church, and that's the opportunity. Now, here's what you don't find. When you ask somebody, and you probably don't, why don't you go to church? The person does not say, because I believe in Darwinism. I believe that there was no purpose in the universe, that everything that took place prior to the evolution of man was purposeless, that nothing took place according to any sort of plan or foreplanning whatsoever, and that only with the advent of man, and usually that means the advent of the planning state, was there purpose and planning introduced into history. But prior to man, there was no purpose. Do you think that person is going to tell you that? No, he's not going to tell you that. Even if he says he believes in Darwinism, he hasn't really thought about it in 25 years or 30 years, and he never really took a course in it. He took courses that taught it, but he never really took a course in the philosophy of Darwinism, because actually those courses aren't offered on campus. They're considered superfluous. So he can't articulate this thing very well, and that's not the reason he doesn't go to church. He doesn't go to church because he likes to sleep in late, or he likes to, well, he used to say, I like to read the New York Times. If he lived in New York, he'd say, I like to read the Sunday Times. And he did like to read the Sunday Times, but there's not much of the Sunday Times anymore. They can read online, I guess, but the physical Sunday Times is not so big a deal. It's referred to, by the way, as the old gray lady. Well, the old gray lady ain't what she used to be. At best, there's an increase in the number of people who read the online edition, but that's only because they're opposed to Trump. The number of people subscribing prior to the election of 2016 kept declining, but Trump mania, which is really Trump mania in opposition, or anti-Trump mania, has now led to increased number of paying subscribers for the New York Times. But that answer, I like to read the Sunday paper, you never heard from anybody else. Nobody read the Chicago Tribune as the alternative of going to church, or the Los Angeles Times. There are no good reasons, they think, for going to church. There's no systematic reason or philosophy behind it, but there's a commitment to it. There really is a commitment to not going to church. They are systematic in their commitment to not going. They just don't have a very developed reason for not going. And that's the opportunity. Because there will be crises. There are crises in people's lives. There are crises in people's families. People die. They get sick. They get fired. And ultimately, there's going to be a monumental crisis that I have called the Great Default. And the Great Default is going to take place when the amount of money available to send out to Social Security and Medicare and send to Medicaid hospitals is going to come into conflict with the money to be spent on weaponry. There's going to be a battle, and I think it's going to be at least in full-scale warfare within a decade, and maybe less, where the only money available to pay to Granny is going to come out of the pocket and budget of General Whoosh and General Bang and General Boom. It's going to come out of the Pentagon, or it's going to come out of the federal bureaucracy, because Granny's going to want her share, and she's got the votes, and she's going to get her share, and she's going to call it her fair share. And so there's going to be a battle, because there won't be any more budgets left in the federal budget that will be referred to as discretionary. There will only be undiscretionary budgets, budgets that have been set by previous legislation. And now, every dollar extra that's spent on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid will have to come out of some of the other budgets. And that's when the political battles are going to begin. And then the real battle, the life and death battle of world, or at least Western politics, is going to be when there's not enough money to send to Granny anymore. And that's when the crisis, the rethinking of the American welfare state is going to take place. And it's not just America, it's all of Western Europe, it's Japan. Any nation that has adopted a program of government-funded retirement is going to hit the brick wall, and they're going to hit the brick walls around the world prior to 2050, prior to the time when 9.5 billion people will be on this planet. Atheists and agnostics in the United States, maybe 20%. They've had control of the public schools for a century, and they still have not been able to convince more than about 20% of the population of the position. They're in defensive mode, and they're going to be more and more in defensive mode. That basically is my presentation. We have a tremendous opportunity. I think we should take advantage of that opportunity. We're going to have to find ways of taking advantage of it, finding new ways of evangelism, new techniques of evangelism. There's nothing set in concrete. There are tremendous opportunities. It's my opinion that we should very definitely, from this point on, begin to think in local churches, how do we take advantage of our situation? There should be somebody every week saying to a group of 6 or 8 people, well, who did you talk to this week? And at some point, the person who was asked that question is finally going to say, well, I didn't do it this week, but I am really, really going to do it next week. Thank you very much.